There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today. I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this is episode number 403. And today, we're kicking off a new series in which we're diving deep into specific types of habitat with a roundtable of experts. And today, that's hill country habitat, and we're talking with Andy May, Joe Elsinger, and Justin Wright. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast brought to you by Onyx. Today we're kicking off a new series, and this series is all about getting into the nitty-gritty details of specific types of habitat across the country. If you were to look across the country, you can kind of bucket certain parts of, the deer hunting world within these I guess for lack of a better word, categories. You've got hill country, like what we're talking about today. You could say we've got agricultural land. You could say there's big woods habitat, there's swamps, there's mountains, there's open country. There's all these different types of ground we might spend our time hunting deer. And each one of these different locations and types can be found really in different parts of the country, but each of them requires a different set of ideas and skills and information and even hunting philosophies. And so what we're going to try to do over the next, I don't know how many weeks it's going to end up being, but we're going to get a collection of experts on these topics together to talk through all the different things they think about when it comes to these specific kinds of places we hunt. And this was inspired by my buddy Andy May. If you listen to the podcast, you know Andy. He's one of the very best deer hunters in the country. I'm convinced of that. And he does it all DIY, a lot of public land or private land by permission. And he is one of these guys who I frequently look to for inspiration or guidance. And the interesting thing is that he came to me with this idea saying, hey man, I'm trying to learn more. This is one of the best guys out there in the world saying, I'm trying to learn more. And the way he was trying to learn more was by pulling in these groups of people who he viewed as experts on these topics and picking their brain. And so we got to thinking, what if we did that, but instead of it just being, on a phone by ourselves, what if we share that with everybody out there? What if we share that with all the deer hunters out there that are probably curious about the same thing? So I tasked Andy with coming up with the people he wants to hear from, the people that he views as being the most likely to teach him something new about each of these different habitat types. And then we set out to schedule these conversations and to get these groups of people together where each one of us can share our ideas and then bounce ideas off each other, maybe argue different perspectives, maybe agree, maybe not. Today we're starting that. And today, as I mentioned, it's hill country. We've got Andy kind of leading the discussion. I'm sitting in as a steering the bus as we go kind of character. And then we're also joined by Joe Elsinger and Justin Wright. And I'll have Andy introduce these guys here in a minute so you can learn more about why he views them as the right experts to talk about hill country hunting. But I just got to say, this is a riveting conversation. And yeah, I know when this episode's coming out, it's January. A lot of us are maybe taking a little time away from deer hunting, but now is the time to learn. Now is the time to be thinking. Now is the time to be planning for the next hunting season. And I think this conversation, if it does anything like what it did for me, it's going to give you that kick in the butt to jump right back into it. And I'm pretty excited about that. So with all that out of the way, I will just let you get right into it. I hope you enjoy it. And here we go with my conversation with Andy May, Joe Elsinger, and Justin Wright. All right, with me on the phone, we have got kind of the, if you're a superhero fan, you like those Marvel movies, imagine the Avengers of the deer hunting world. We've got Andy May, Justin Wright, and Joe Elsinger on the phone with me. I might be, that character, if you've ever seen these movies, Samuel Jackson is the guy that, I don't even know what his name is in the movies, but he's just kind of the guy that says, you do this, what do you think about this? And then he sits back in the office and lets them all do the fighting. That's kind of my role here tonight. So what I want to do, and rather than do the whole like introduction thing that we do on a lot of podcasts, I don't think I'm going to do that as normal because there's four of us and there's so much good stuff to talk about. I want to begin with you, Andy, because you and I were having a conversation the other day, and the conversation is what sparked us doing this podcast. And I'd love to get you to explain that a little bit more. You were saying, I remember I was pacing back and forth in my living room as we were talking. You were stressing me out so much with what you were saying because you were saying, man, I just feel like I've never been more frustrated in a hunting season than I was this past year. And I'm thinking to myself, Andy, you had one of the most successful hunting seasons like any normal person could ever ask for. You killed 3 or 4 really impressive, mature whitetail bucks. You killed a giant mule deer. And still, you were sitting here focusing on, how can I get better? How can I learn more about this terrain? How could I figure out what to do in this kind of situation or this kind of situation? And you were telling me how you were, reinvigorated and just chomping at the bit to get better, to talk to more people, to get more ideas. And it was, I don't know what it was. It was maybe inspiring, or maybe it made me hate you just a little bit more that you were going to get even better than you already are. And so what I want you to do is, can you explain like can you explain your mindset after the season you just had and where you are now that has led you to pulling people like this together to have in-depth conversations? How did you get here, Andy? Why you think this way?
Well, I think I've always had that mindset. I know I've mentioned it in a lot of podcasts. I think when I really think about my goal, my main goal as a deer hunter is, I would just want to become the best hunter that I can be. And I've always had that real strong drive to learn and seek out information from guys that I think are more knowledgeable than me and more skilled than me. This year, I'm not asking anyone to feel sorry for me, but it's just how I feel. This year, I did have some great success. I had some phenomenal hunts, but I made some really key mistakes on some really big deer this year that have really left a bad taste in my mouth. I take failure pretty hard. I mean, the successes are great. But when I fail at something that I did wrong or that I should have done, that I could have done, man, those really stick with me. And I don't know, I guess it's just the way I'm wired. But there was just a couple of situations and hunts and times throughout the season where I just felt real frustrated. I had 4 great hunts, but I hunted more than I ever did this year. And there was a lot of time in between those and around those where, I felt like I was really struggling and I wouldn't say lost, but I felt like I wasn't on top of my game, I guess. And none of us are going to be, deadly 100% of the time, but it does get a little frustrating when the majority of your season you feel like that. I haven't felt like that in quite a while. I certainly have moments, but I guess I came out of this season not liking that feeling. And you said it best. I just felt, I guess, re-energized to really, really try to improve some of these areas that I feel I could improve in. And one of the areas that I certainly feel competent in, but I wouldn't say my confidence is the highest, is in hill country. And I've been hunting more and more of that. I really like the hills. I feel like I'm maybe a little above average, but I know a couple of guys that I mean, as far as I'm concerned, they're two of the best hill country guys in the country. I know there's guys out there that we don't know. I'm sure they're not going to agree with that, but I mean, I know deer and I know deer hunting and I know deer hunters, and these guys are some of the best. And they're not only some of the best deer hunters, they're just some of the best guys. They're consistent. They're DIY guys like me. They hunt a lot of pressured land. I don't know. I just look up to them, and we're lucky enough to have both those guys on here now. So the first guy, Joe Elsinger, a lot of people know Joe. He's been on a few podcasts. He's kind of a legend on the hunting beast. Man, Joe is he's just one of those guys that when you hear about his season and the way he hunts, it kind of makes you feel like you don't know a whole lot. He's just, his hunts are very detail oriented. He almost like engineers them in his mind with the way his setups are and the conditions, and he takes so many things into account. And I just really admire the way he hunts and the way he goes about his hunts, because it's a little different than me. We have some similarities, but he just takes it to a whole new level, I think, with his efficiency. And he's just a guy that I've always learned from, and I've been fortunate enough to become friends with him and keep in contact with him. And I'm just really thankful for that, because I've learned a lot from him. The other guy on the episode today is Justin Wright, who, again, another hunting beast guy. Man, probably one of the most deadly guys I know. A straight DIY hunter. And he just, every year, he just kind of leaves me in awe with what he does on such limited time. Both these guys, kind of like myself, maybe even more so, definitely this year. I mean, these are family guys. These are guys that, don't hunt big leases. They don't hunt, big family farms. It's a mix of, pressured private ground and public, and they travel around to different chunks, and they're just as deadly as they come, and they're super efficient. So they're family men first. They're good guys first. They're humble, but on such limited time, they do things that just almost don't seem possible. And both of their specialties, I think they're probably deadly in just about any situation, but both their specialties are hill country. And I just feel real fortunate to have them on this episode so that we can all kind of dive into their minds a little bit and learn. It should be a good one.
Yeah. Well, I'm feeling the same way. I'm excited, and these are the three of you are all three folks who all of us can learn from, me especially. I always feel like with Joe, he's of all the different, maybe not everyone, but if I can look at a lot of different people's hunting styles and the way they go about things, I see the way that Joe approaches it and his analytical mindset. It seems very much like what I want to be like, what I try to get to, but I inevitably fall into these circular circular arguments with myself that send me down different rabbit holes, and 1 out of 5 times I pull it off right. But I feel like every time I get a chance to talk to you, it's going to help me get a little bit closer to that goal destination. And Justin, I'm excited that we finally get to talk. Andy has been talking to me about getting you on the podcast for a long time now, so I'm glad it's happening. And I'm going to kind of play, like I mentioned, I'm going to kind of sit in the background a little bit and maybe kind of play the audience member. I'll let Andy be the host. I'll let him drive the ship. He'll be the school bus driver, and I'm going to be the kid in the back seat of the bus, the kid I'm not necessarily going to be looking out the back window waving at all the other cars, but I'll kind of let you guys have this conversation, because I know Andy's wanted to have these talks with you guys in more detail, and I'm going to listen in. And when I'm confused by something, or if I hear something that I think other people might be wondering more about, or if you really get my curiosity going, I'll jump in. But otherwise, I want to kind of be a fly on the wall and just sit here in the circle of legends and see what we can get into. So Andy, let's scratch your itch. Where do you want to start? What are you dying to know from these guys to begin this conversation about hill country?
All right. Well, let's just start with something that's kind of pretty basic. This is what I do when I'm going into a new piece of hill country. When I'm looking at the topo maps, I look for ridge systems. I call them dynamic ridge systems. I don't know if that's the right term, but I look for ridge systems that have a lot of terrain features, a lot of points jutting off in different directions, saddles, benches. The more terrain and the more dynamic it is, the better. And those are the ridge systems that I'm kind of drawn to. And I tend to stay away from the ones that are more long, less points, maybe just off that main ridge, maybe just 1 or 2, secondary points. And I guess I've never really been told that that's a good or bad thing, but I wanted to get your guys' opinions on that approach. And maybe if you could dive into what you look for. If you're starting from scratch, you're going to a whole new piece of hill country, and what you look for. So let's start with you, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. First off, thanks, Mark, for having us back on. Always say that for Justin too. This should be a good conversation, but yeah, you're definitely feel flattered by your guys' descriptions. Maybe we can dive into some of the failures I've had this year, because I had some pretty good luck, but I have to admit that when Andy described his season as, kind of focusing on what went wrong, I have that similar mindset where I royally screwed up a couple of times, and it bugs the heck out of me. So definitely does not go right all the time, or even most of the time for me. So, but anyway, specific to this, so yeah, all else being equal, and it really is, the more rugged the ground, the better, in my opinion. It's just, the more terrain features you have, the better in hill country. But you don't get that often. You can't, you might be hunting properties that are really steep and rugged, or you might be hunting properties that have just gentle rolling hills that funnel the deer way less aggressively. And then, in some of the gentle hills, you have to deal with really the deer move more according to cover than terrain. There's kind of a point where, when it becomes the hills become so steep that the deer have to work going up and down them. That's when the terrain seems to be the dominant factor in how deer move. And then when it's a little flatter, I couldn't tell you a slope, or I couldn't tell you an elevation. It's kind of case by case. But you should think of it like that, where the flatter hills, you kind of have to focus more on the cover and transition, et cetera. And the steeper stuff, transition can still be important, but terrain becomes the driving factor for how they move. So yeah, I like points and saddles and, crow's feet ridges where a whole bunch of points come together. That's one of the key areas that I would focus on. when you have a whole bunch of secondary points come together, that's often a really killer area. If the cover is reasonably good, conducive for, bedding on those ends of those points. Benches are another thing, and benches are a thing that I think our predecessors long ago kind of realized that wildlife travel on benches and bed on benches, but I don't hear much discussion about benches in current hunting community, and they're kind of hard to spot on a topo map. They're just where the contours get spaced out a little bit on a side hill. So you have contours that are all stacked tight. You show the steep slope and they space out and they get tight again. Well, it's a bench. And deer bed on them and they travel on them. So the bigger the hills, they really like those benches. Some of the 300-400 foot bluffs that I hunt, and I really spot those benches, and it doesn't seem like, the secret's out now talking about it, but it doesn't seem like very many hunters try to hunt those. The wind can be dicey, but there's ways to, pull off hunts on those benches. So yeah, I guess that's a quick summary of where, how I kind of look at it. Basically similar to you, Andy, that the more terrain features, the better usually, that really funnel deer. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's what I look for now. But my first year hunting Iowa, I was hunting hill country, and I was on a ridge that had, it was a CRP field on top. So it had an opening on top that was good cover.
So you probably went and hunted the inside corner, right?
I did, yeah. But this ridge was very long. Didn't have a lot of points coming off of it, so it was kind of, it lacked a lot of features. But on the end of that long point, just kind of a long, narrow point without much going on, was to this day the biggest typical buck I've ever seen in Iowa. And it was interesting, now I don't draw a lot of attention to those types of ridges for some reason. But I did see a real big buck. I didn't see a lot of deer, but I did see a real big buck bedded on the end of that.
Yeah, and the length of a ridge system. So if you're rut hunting, other times of year, deer aren't moving as far, but rut, those long ridges are mega funnels. Bucks are running up and down. So if you've got a system that's half a mile long or more, and you can get in the middle of it, that's, even if you're not real close to bedding, if it's peak rut and, you've got decent deer population, you can have, that's one of those things, going blind, you could have a great hunt. I agree. So particularly I would say during the rut, outside of the rut, you kind of have to look at more of the micro features.
Sure.
Exactly where they're bedding, where they're feeding. So,
yeah. Okay. Hey, Justin, how about you?
Yeah, I would piggyback kind of off of what both you guys said. Joe was talking about the long ridges, and I know that's something before I think you had mentioned, Andy, that, you kind of look past those. I have seen a lot of during the rut. I've seen a lot of cruising on the sides of those. Kind of going back and forth, checking different doe groups and stuff, on the ends of those ridges and stuff. So I would agree with that. But for me, I've mainly hunted more rolling hills. I've got into a little bit of the steeper stuff, the bluff country here in the past few years. And it does seem like, kind of what Joe said, it seems like the deer are a little more predictable based on like the terrain, terrain features kind of funnel them a little more. But the rolling hills, for me, it's about diversity. I have to find diversity, multiple different cover edges coming together, because they really seem to, kind of like Joe said, they really seem to stick to the cover more so than kind of the terrain funneling them. And I'll be honest, I think in the rolling hills, the winds and stuff they just seem to be a little bit more difficult because of the thermals don't have quite as strong a play, as they do in like the steeper terrain. So me, yeah, it's diversity. I do have to say, I've seen a lot of I've kicked a lot of bucks up. I've killed a lot of bucks in these bowl-shaped ridges. These ridges that's like, so it'd be like a ridge like in the shape of a C, and it has several secondary points that jut down off of it, offering a buck, several different points to bet on based on the winds and stuff. And I have seen a ton of bucks betting in those.
Mm-hmm.
That's really one thing that I really look for.
Yep.
I've just had some really good
Me
luck
too.
with those. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, you guys kind of hit on it though. Pretty much the same. I mean, the saddles and all that, the points. That's all things I look for. But probably the first thing would be the bowls. I don't know. I've just had a lot of luck finding bucks bedded in those.
All right. Well,
they're very hard to hunt.
Yeah, let's. I was going to ask about bowls a little later, but since we're on that and we're talking about bucks bedding, let's talk about you hear about the leeward side of the ridge, on the points and whatnot, and that's really the majority of what you hear about as far as mature bucks bedding. So we know that's one of the features. And now Justin and Joe, you mentioned these bowls, and I've seen that as well. I've also seen them down low, and I've also seen them bed just right at the head of a drainage on a really thick hillside, like right where that drainage comes to where it dies off at the top there, below the ridge top, but at the head of the drainage. So can you guys, Justin, let's start with you. Why don't you go through some of the all the types of features that you have seen mature bucks bet on, besides just points?
I've seen them bet down low too. A lot of times, I don't know if that's more based on, so like here, for instance, than the majority of the stuff I hunt. A lot of your access would be from the tops of these ridges. And then guys will, they'll go out a certain distance and then they'll jut down off this ridge and they'll hunt that. Well, I don't know if it's just, if the deer is going to survive there, they're going to have to do something to get away from that pressure. So they're going to drop down a little bit lower. I don't know about actually bedding in the bottom, but I have seen them bed a lot lower on the, like the points. Even I'm talking 10 feet from the bottom, and again, this is more so in your rolling hills. I've seen a bed, like you said, Andy. I've seen a bed at the head of drainage systems. I have seen them bed on just like a bench on the side, especially in the late season. It seems like when the weather's cool and they're trying to get some sun, bed on them south-facing slopes and getting out of the wind. Man, I have seen them bed, of course, on points. That's the majority of the time on the secondary point is where you'll find them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, even in the open, hardwoods, if you got some blowdowns, treetops and stuff, it looks rather open, but you've got a little bit of cover there. And I've seen them bet on that, and it could even be up on the very top of a ridge, even. I've seen it bet in a lot of weird places. I know that I think everybody believes it. Look for the points, and I would say that's probably where they bet the majority of the time. But I've seen them in a lot of weird and odd places.
And I'll jump in real quick and ask you a follow-up, Justin. Has it been pretty consistent that they use those features in relation to a certain wind direction? Like Andy mentioned, typically you'll hear about the leeward side of a ridge. How do you think about wind when trying to predict, where these bucks might be bedded in that kind of terrain?
Yes and no. That makes sense. So I've seen the majority of the time, yes, I would say they're bedding on, the leeward side based on wind direction and all that. But I have seen them take a bowl. This is kind of hard to explain, but take a bowl and say the wind is coming over on the east side of that bowl, and the buck may be bedded on the eastern side of the the other ridge system, as the bowl shaped around on the other side of it. But the wind will kind of come up and go. Once you get into them, a lot of times you still find that the wind is doing something kind of funny. So it would roll over that one ridge and cause a swirling effect to where that deer can pretty much, anything around him, he's gonna catch you. He's gonna get a whiff of you at some point there. But I have seen a bed on windward slopes. It's not always the wind over the back thing. I think sometimes visual comes into play. In the winter times and stuff, they like to get in the sun, so they'll get wherever they can do that. But I do believe no matter what, they have some sort of an advantage. So they're not just going to lay down in the spot, that they're vulnerable in.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think a lot of times like that, like I said, on the windward slopes, I think the wind, a lot of times if you get right in those beds, you'll start to feel the wind doing some funny things as it swirls around or, whatever. So.
Makes sense.
So, Joe, do you see some of those same things?
Yeah. Justin hit on a lot of the good points. I'd expand on a thing or two that I've seen. I think bucks, the lower they bed, the less aligned they are to the leeward slopes. So up high, yeah, most of the time it seems like they are bedding on the leeward sides, leeward point, knobs and stuff. As they bed down lower, you're really seeing a break in that correlation. You see it sometimes, but not as often. And for everybody's reference, some people have heard this before, but I run a lot of trail cameras. I'm not hunting on my cameras. I'm doing it just to learn more about deer. So I leave cameras soak in spots for 3-4 months, and then look at the observations and correlate them with weather data, all that stuff, wind, temperature, pressure, humidity, cloud cover, time of year, all that jazz. And I see a ton of correlations, and sometimes I don't see them. The deer move and bed very consistent to the wind up high, down low. There's less of that consistency. And I agree with Justin. I see bucks bedding all the time, kind of on low points or low benches, so they can kind of look out across the bottom, or a bowl. They love bedding around those perimeter, those bowls. And those are kind of thermal hub, I think. So a lot of times you'll see the rubs or scrapes, and bucks they really like to drop down off their bed down through that bowl and then kind of up the other side. I see that a lot. And the one thing I would add there is when you're talking bottom, when a bottom gets to a certain size, it seems like that's when bucks start bedding down in it, and not just bucks, but does too. And I don't know, it's couple hundred yards apart, yards across, when deer start feeling more secure and bedding down in that bottom. And I think it's a matter of they don't feel as trapped. It might be a little claustrophobic if it's real tight and constricted, the narrow bottom. But a bigger bottom, then they bed down in that cover, and that's when they start treating it like a bigger swamp or marsh, even though it might not be marshy or swampy, but they're bedding out in that bigger bottom. So I'd bring that up. That's when I see them actually bed down in there when it gets a little bigger.
Have you seen, Joe, any? You both, Justin and Joe, you both mentioned many different types of spots within a hill country setting that they could be bedded. As I'm listening to this, one of the first things I'm wondering is, well, how the hell do I figure out what they're using now? Right? They could be there, and they could be there, and they could be here. And if I was walking onto a new piece of ground, I would just be swimming in all these different ideas. One of the first things I'm thinking, if I was trying to filter this down and make sense of it, I would say, okay, well, would the time of year change where they'd be bedded? Do you see any correlation between time of the season, so early season versus the rut versus late season or anything like that, that would give you guidance as to how to pick your most likely bedding spots? Is it, in the early season when there's lots of leaf cover, they're more likely to be bedded high, and when it's late season, they're more likely to be bedded lower? I don't know. Is there anything like that comes to mind?
Yeah, I definitely have. So, in hill country, I would say general rule of thumb, majority of deer are going to be bedded up high, but there are a lot of like it's not a big majority, it's a slight majority. So time of year is a big thing, and within that time of year, the biggest factor is, in my opinion, comfort. Besides hunting pressure, I ain't touching hunting pressure, but comfort. Late season, deer are going to favor those southerly exposures. They're going to be, I don't know that they're going to be up high, but they're going to be up high enough so they can get sun. They're not going to be necessarily down in thick cover unless there's no sun. If it's a blizzard, that's one of my favorite times to hunt down in a bottom is when a blizzard rolls through in hill country, because all those deer drop down to the bottom to get out of the wind and the snow. And I've had some crazy good hunts, just seeing tons and tons of deer, bucks, hays, and does, and in December, like weird stuff, in the middle of a blizzard, down low. And early season, if it's hot out, they favor those cool north slopes, or bottoms where the bottom might be a little tighter, or has water in it, and they'll bed close to the water, so it's cooler down there. So comfort's a big thing, and then hunting pressure is the other big variable, and that has a big impact. I've said it before, but when the pressure's, when access is up high, that pushes deer down. When access is down low, it pushes deer up. It's wherever the hunters are the thickest, the deer are going to be in the other elevation, basically. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Justin, would you add anything to that question about how time of year might impact where they choose to bed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Joe's spot on there. I will say, I think Joe hunts, and I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Joe, but I think you hunt tend to hunt more rugged terrain, deeper, rugged terrain. In the hills here, like I said, with the rolling hills, I will see them bed lower. And I think a lot of that is due to, access being from the top and stuff. But even in the early season and stuff, I see them bedding down lower. And I don't know if it is, you drop down off in there, and it generally it's a lot cooler down there. And the winds in the rolling hills will stay, I don't want to say stay consistent because they're hardly ever consistent, but you'll feel them down in there. The wind will still be at the back, even further down in, because it's more, of a gradual slope versus like a deep drop. But yeah, I would say, Joe, I would agree with all that. I do see them bedding higher, it seems, in the later season, and I think that's, get up high and get some sun. And generally, it seems like late season, you can pretty much, for the most part anyways, from what I see, it seems like they're bedding more wind-based. And I think it's a lot of times to get out of the wind, block the wind.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he pretty much hit on everything there.
Yeah. And Justin, when you say you're seeing them bed lower, is that like, say, halfway down the hill, or
I don't want to
down?
I would say about halfway down, Joe, generally. It kind of depends on too, where the cover's at. Even in the early season, sometimes if it's a rather open area, it still seems like they favor the cover. So if the color covers, on the bottom third, even I've seen them bed down in there. But I would say, that 1/3, that was one thing that I think a lot of guys around here, that was preached a lot on the hunting beast. And I agree with it in most cases, but I believe that, in the rolling hills, there's exceptions to that. And the deer just kind of bed. If you get a stronger wind day, they're bedding lower. Light variable winds, it seems like they do bed a little bit higher. There's just so many variables, so situational with that. But yeah.
I want to circle back around to the bulls real quick, because Justin, you and I had this conversation. You told me that you see some of your your biggest, most mature deer bed in those bowls, and they seem almost bulletproof. And after you said that, I started thinking back, because most of my hill country has been in Ohio, Iowa, and a little bit in Indiana, and then in Kentucky. And there was an early season several years ago where I was hunting a pretty nice buck, and he was bedded in that same type of terrain feature, like a bowl. And I couldn't get in there without getting busted, because I just could not get a consistent wind. And I went in there twice and got busted twice. But Joe, I asked you about that, and you have found a unique circumstance or a set of conditions that you feel like you can hunt that effectively.
Yeah. Some of the time, and then I'll conclude this with a story about how it didn't work this year on me. Yeah, so I see that too. And I think it's because of the popularity, the spreading popularity of, hill country hunting and people focusing on leeward slopes, the military crest, the classic places where deer do move. But once the pressure's up on the ridges, then, like I've said, I've seen that push down lower. And to Justin's point, I would stress to everybody listening, think about how steep your hills are, and if they're more rolling versus steep enough that a deer doesn't want to travel up and down it very easily, that really changes how they use it. And if they can bed, the entire slope versus they could, only top and bottom, it's so steep. That's a big difference. So down in those bowls, I have found there's two circumstances that I found consistent winds, and I'm a fanatic about this. Like in the off season, I'm carrying milkweed with me scouting, and sometimes if I don't carry it all the time, but I'll carry a couple of sticks and I'll try to get up in a tree and I'll drop milkweed like in the spring, and just see what it does. And I'll take note of those weather conditions and, try to figure out if I can have a consistent air current down low. So I've done a lot of experimenting. And I like situations where there's almost no wind. And so the predominant activity is just thermals. That's a little tricky because, of course, you got a thermal switch. But say, even like a cool overcast day, you don't have much for rising thermals. And the thermal switch might be happening pretty early in the afternoon or late in the morning. And you can get like a consistent, I really like those consistent downdrafts, early in the morning and down at night. And I set up right next to usually a big bowl. Usually it's got a ditch or something. And if I set up right next to that ditch, that's getting pulled down into the ditch fairly well. And you can have a safe hunt that way. And the other circumstance is the opposite, is a screaming wind over the hill over top. And this is usually for those steeper hills. And this is something it might be my favorite tactic. Get a screaming wind over a ridge, coming across the ridge, and you're on the leeward side, except I'm way down at the bottom on the leeward side, or wherever the deer are down low. And the air is getting pulled back up that leeward side. So it's actually, it's a vacuum effect. That's what's causing it. It's not a rising thermal, it's a vacuum effect. And if I get a 20+ mile an hour sustained wind over the ridge, I know I'm going to usually have a consistent updraft. The tricky thing there is wind dies down a lot of time, first light, last light. There's a big buck around. That's bad because then it starts to get swirly. But if you have that consistent wind, I've had situations where I have a consistent updraft and I'm dropping milkweed and it's going right over my head all the time. Like it's impossible for a deer to smell me unless it's flying, and I love those situations because deer, they think they're in this bulletproof situation down low where they're used to smelling everything, and I can get in there. And I've killed a couple of big bucks doing that. So, that sounds all well good, and it works. I've got proof. But this year, I was after a big old buck, and this big 9-point typical split G2s, and He loved to bed on a low benches around this big bowl, real rugged terrain, and he loved to bed down there. Well, the bowl was kind of oriented northwest, southeast. So with the northwest wind, it was I was going for a light northwest wind and a falling thermal. Those were aligned going down into the bowl. And I set up right by the ditch. He'd been there last year. This is a circumstance. He was there last year. I checked my camera once. I knew he was on camera. I knew he was around this. He was alive. I figured he'd been in the same spot. He was 6 years old this year, I estimated. And mid-October, it was second week of October, I think. This is my first or second hunt of the season. And I set up, got it. I snuck in there, up the ditch, crawl up a tree, perfect. And that wily old deer, he just dropped down into the bowl and he dropped down into the ditch, which I never thought he would have, about 60 yards downwind. And I saw him, and then he was downwind to me, but he was up on the rim of the ditch. And I did not think, he couldn't smell me. My scent was getting pulled down into this ditch. This ditch was fairly big. It was probably 30 feet across. And then he dropped down in the ditch and boom, up came his head. And that was it. So he outsmarted me. Now, I had the last laugh because I put my brother down there a few weeks later, not in the exact spot, but nearby, and he killed him in early November. So he's dead. But, it's tricky. Hunting low is tricky. Hunting hills in general is tricky with the air currents, but hunting low is really tricky. So be prepared to screw up.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Justin, have you ever attempted anything or found a way to successfully hunt those bulls?
Well, like in the rolling hills and stuff, I understand what Joe's saying, and I can see that in the steeper terrain. And you may still get that in certain situations with the more gently rolling hills. But from my experience, it's just really hard to get any kind of a consistent wind in there. I did find kind of a unique situation a few years ago, and it actually ended up being the biggest buck that I've ever put an arrow through. What this situation was, there was a couple guys that had found some sign down in this hole, and they basically set up camp. They put a ladder stand down on the bottom. They put a hang on the side of this ridge, and I found it that spring before that. I went in there to check it out, because I do a lot of kind of in-season scouting, checking areas, and looking for fresh sign in and around the perimeters of these bedding areas. But I knew that buck was in there. It was a great bedding area. And once I seen all that sign, I seen these ribbons and everything, I just kind of left it alone. Well, then fast forward to that following spring, I went back in there and noticed the sign was there. The buck was back in there. You could see the bed was being used. So the following year, I was waiting to see how it's set up like the head of the bowl. So it's kind of a C-shaped, bowl. The head of the bowl would have been facing to the west. The buck was bedding kind of on the southern side of this slope with the wind coming over his back. And I waited on a day. It was 85 degrees. It was early October, and the wind was blowing out of the southwest. Well, it was blowing kind of over the head of this bowl and then down into the bowl, blowing kind of with it out toward the mouth of it. And I set up basically on the mouth of this bowl. As this buck dropped down off this point, he was swinging down low of that bowl, because there was still a stand in there, and I'm confident that deer was checking that area out. For one, I think most of the time you could see him. In the early season, it was rather thick down in there, so I think he would just safely drop down off this. Well, I was set up on the northern side, and as he swung around, got a whiff, everything was clear, nobody was down on the bottom. He carried on about his way, and he come on up, got an arrow in. Most of the time on the bowls for me, I have to find either how they're entering or exiting the bowl in order to get an opportunity. And a lot of times, I'll be honest, it has to be like on a front or something like that. It seems like these big old deer, they just drop down off in them things, and they kind of hang up in there in the evenings. And man, by the time they make it out of them, you're not getting a shot at it. It's manipulate, or they dip into them, way too early in the morning. I will say, if you know how that deer's entering that, and you can manipulate the wind, get below him, or get just down, to where your thermals will be falling, dropping on further off to where he can't get it. But I've had my butt kicked more times than I've been successful in the bulls. I'll say that.
Yeah, Justin, you're most of the time when you're seeing a buck bedded around the side of a bull, are you seeing it use them like that? It sounds like you are. Like when they get up, they're dropping down in. Yes. Whether they're going across or at least, so they're using it. That's why they're there.
Right.
In my opinion. Yeah.
And like you said earlier, a lot of times down in those bottoms, or at least from my experience, I find a lot of sign, a lot of scrapes, a lot of rubs. And that's what drew the attention to those guys that set up camp down there. They set up right over this stuff. And that buck, obviously is bedding up on that side, and he can watch as they enter or hear them or whatever. So,
but I see the same thing. Yeah.
Now, a lot of you guys are familiar with the old hunting tradition of eating, some organ, the heart or a chunk of liver off the first animal you kill. I had that when I was a little kid, and it was a big deal. Organ meats were always prized by frontier people who knew the importance of getting a lot of different minerals and nutrients. And as often is the case, those guys were onto something, because organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. And you can get the same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil, made exclusively from regeneratively raised, grass-fed, and finished cattle. Heart and Soil's unique freeze-drying process means all those important nutrients are trapped in, ensuring you experience every one of the benefits of nature's superfood in a clean, convenient, taste-free capsule. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And make sure to use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. That's heartandsoil.co. Use the code MeatEater. There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store, or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
Justin, you mentioned, sorry, Andy, I'll jump in really quick. You had mentioned that one of the better ways you've found to actually hunt those spots is to find where they're entering and exiting the bull, because that's a little bit safer for you. For someone listening who doesn't exactly know how to pinpoint that entrance or exit, could you describe what it is you're looking for to help you determine that, this is how they're getting in and out?
Most of the time, saddles, to be quite honest with you. If there's a slight little saddle that kind of dips off into that bowl, gosh, a lot of times, if that deer is going to cross that in daylight hours, it's going to be through something like that. Something where, he's safe and secure, not going to be skylined. And then a lot of times too, there may not be sign right on top of the ridge, as far as like a rub or a scrape or something like that. But you can generally find sign kind of leading in or out of those bowls, on the ridge there. But I be honest, a lot of them I've seen dip through saddles, and it may not be a big obvious saddle that shows up on a topo map. Sometimes you just have to get out there and scout it, and you'll just see a slight little dip in the ridge there, and that's where that buck will dip through.
Yep.
From my experience.
That's one of my favorite saddles are important, but the bigger ones do attract hunters pretty easily. So like you mentioned, the ones, when you find one that might drop, 5 feet or 10 feet from the ridge, you can't see it on a topo until you're walking through it. And you're like, only my head's sticking out. along the ridge. Those can be lethal.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that hunt example that you just gave, Justin, reminded me of something. Those guys were kind of set up in the bottom there where there was some sign down there. And I remember seeing that. You sent me that map and topo, which was really cool to see how that hunt unfolded, by the way. But I remember it
too.
Yeah. That bottom was relatively tight. And I remember, on the beast, the consensus was, don't hunt the bottoms, stay out of the bottoms. And it was ironic because every time I read that, or when I was reading that, there was actually a spot in Iowa that I had killed 2 bucks 2 years or two times that I hunted it in a row when I drew the tag, and then my buddy killed one out of the same stand. It was a couple trees over, but same area, and it was in a bottom. But what was unique about this bottom, and Joe, you touched about on this a little bit ago, but it was a wide bottom. So what I loved about this spot was it was where several points dropped down into the same direction. So there was like 4 or 5 points that were kind of all pointed down into this bottom, pointed in the general same area, pointing in this general same direction. And at the bottom was actually like an overgrown, like set aside field. And I would hunt that bottom ran east and west. So anytime I had a west wind, I could get basically where all those points dumped down and converge. There was a lot of travel coming up and down those points and crisscrossing. And I would get right at the bottom where all those travel routes converged with that west wind, but I would be just on the east side of where most of the crisscrossing was going. And man, it was like, honestly, it literally would be like one sit. And I'm not super picky. Like I'm coming from Michigan. It's an out of state trip. Back then I would have 2 or 3 days to hunt. So I was shooting the first, good buck that came by, but it was every time I had that wind, and it was in November, man, the amount of deer I saw and bucks I saw cruising down through that area. And I don't remember ever getting really busted as long as I had that consistent wind. But it was quick, if you're going to wait for a 5-6 year old buck, 150, 60 inches or something, might be a different story. But I was able to get an arrow in a good buck really quickly in that type of scenario. Have you guys ever found anything like that?
Yeah, I got a first question for you, Andy. Where the buck's moving in that you've seen down there, moving consistently, with that wind, like were they using it in a consistent way, or are they moving in a consistent direction? Did you find, or?
Well, it just seemed like, honestly, it was always in that kind of November 4th through the 9th time frame. It just seemed like a lot of cruising going on, to be honest with you. It looked like they were kind of more doing like point A to point B, but they were using these points as travel routes, and they were crossing that bottom, kind of in that, there was like probably a 75-yard radius where all those ridges dumped down, or those points dumped down, and there was tons and tons of buck sign right there in the bottom, scrapes all around the edge. It was a set aside field, and there was a lot of young tree growth down there, like sapling sized trees, and it was just shredded. It had everything you'd want as far as buck sign. Does would come down off, and there'd be, bucks following the doe. It was just like constant action. It was just one of those spots. It was just dynamite. But I always remembered that because everybody was saying never hunt the bottoms. But I think, and we've talked about this a little bit, it's those steep bottoms that are really tough to hunt. You get one that has a decent width on it. Yeah. If you hunt it with the right wind, you can hunt it effectively.
Absolutely. Yeah. I got a question for you, Andy, on that. Was that, and you may have mentioned this, was it rather steep terrain around there, or was it more like gently rolling hills? Or
I would say it's more probably what you're used to. Okay. The only place I've hunted that I think might be comparable to what a lot of the stuff Joe hunts is Southern Ohio, and then one spot in Kentucky. And so most of my hill country, I think, has been more rolling to, medium-sized hills, not a ton of real steep country.
Yeah, I've got an example like that, like you were just mentioning. It's actually a spot that me and my dad have both killed. We've actually killed a few bucks out of, and it's a wide bottom. The bottom itself is probably, 150 yards wide or something like that. And man, we have found some very, very consistent cruising, and it's very similar to what you're saying. There's a lot of points that kind of jut right down into this bottom, and it's just I don't know. It's just always held a lot of deer. There is a field kind of out from it, and the deer kind of hug that kind of like an inside corner, but they jut down through there, and we've had a lot of success right down in that bottom on specific wind stuff. So yeah, I have seen.
Joe, I think you've described that. You call that a thermal hub, correct?
Yeah. So it's thermal hub. So I do believe deer are using that to their scent advantage, but it is also the reason these hubs, they're also a terrain hub too. So it's not just scent, but when you have both those line up, when it's the shortest distance from A to B and a deer, a buck can go through there and scent a lot of those surrounding points. He can know if there's a doe up there, or I really think they use it for their defense too. I think they can check if there's hunters on the surrounding ridges by dropping down in those areas. So, they check what's around them, and it's fastest and, most secure point from point A to point B. That's when those super hot spots, like you guys described. I've seen a few of those too. And then often it's like one specific or maybe two specific winds. Usually it's one specific wind. You can get a safe hunt down there.
Yes.
So it's like you just have to sit, and you might not get that wind one season. I've been there where I'm like, a deer's in the area, or it's a hot spot that time of year. You don't have the wind. Don't even try it down low.
Yeah.
I'm sure you guys have been there too. And you push it, and it never seems to work when you push it with the wind. So,
or you get that wind and you can't hunt that night.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
I wanna two things. Number one, I've seen this exact same thing you're describing too in my Southern Ohio spots. The one spot I've hunted a decent bit of hill country, and that exact thing. It seems like there'll be just the certain angle that you'll get that one consistent wind if you've got it. But I just want to make one simple observation for people that are listening, to just kind of simplify a little bit. A lot of the examples you guys have all pointed to have all related to a turkey foot, as you described it earlier, Joe, but in two different versions. There's you could say there's the turkey foot pointing down, which would be where all the fingers are pointing down, and that's a situation that you were talking about earlier today, Joe, when you're talking about hunting up top, where those ridges, and there's multiple ridges that come up to a pinch point of sorts, where you would be at the top of those, and all these ridges come up to it. So you've got the downward facing turkey foot, you want to hunt high. And then there's the inverted turkey foot, where the ridges and the points are coming down to the bottom, and that's when you'd want to hunt low in these spots that you're all describing, assuming you can get the right wind. So just a simple observation, look for those turkey foot type situations and take note, is it the upward facing or the downward facing? And that's going to help you determine where that sweet spot of activity will likely be if you can get the wind right.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very good. It's the same feature. It's just exactly how you put it. Whether it's the top of the ridges or the bottoms that make that kind of hand shape, pattern.
Yeah.
So I got a question here, and I'm guessing, or I guess I'm hoping that the answers varied a little bit, but maybe they won't. But if I took you guys down to an area you're not familiar with, Southern Ohio, Kentucky, down in Indiana hill country, something you had never hunted before, and you had 1 week during bow season to get an arrow and a mature buck, just give me your kind of overall game plan, your strategy from the second you get boots on the ground, you leave your vehicle, to the day you shoot that deer. And I want two examples. I want one where, let's call it just early season, mid-October, and then let's do the same thing more pre-rut, those last couple days of October into the first, week and a half of November. So let's start with you, Justin.
And while you're thinking about your answer, Justin, I just got to say, isn't this guy damn good at hosting? I feel like Andy's going to steal my job here. He's got some good questions here.
He's doing good.
Wired to Hunt, now sponsored by Andy May.
Yeah, exactly. All right, take it away, Justin.
Okay, so we talked about points. We talked about areas that, bucks typically bad. Early season. For me and Andy, I know you know this, and Joe, I think too. And I'm probably more aggressive than most of your guys in the hills. Even on stuff that I know, I'm one of those guys that's not afraid to go bump deer up. And I do that a lot. And I have killed a lot of my bucks by doing that and getting back in there, say, a couple days later. And as both, Joe and Andy know, I've killed several of them coming right back in that same day. So that's going to be my go-to. If I've got a short period of time that I can go on a new piece of ground that, that I've never been on, never stepped foot on, man, I'm going aggressive. I'm going right forward where these deer bed, and I'm going to bump them up, and I'm going to look the area over, and then based on what I find from there, then I'll hunt according, to what I think my best chance at getting a crack at that deer is. And it may be that same day. I'm not opposed to bumping a deer up, depending on how I spook him. If I get him up, and he didn't get my win, I feel confident in that. I've seen a lot of them turn and come right back in there or swing downwind of it, and try to figure out what that was that bumped them up. So that would be kind of what I'm doing. And I'm going to look, for the thicker stuff. If there's any type of ag nearby, I'm probably going to look at the secondary points of stuff that shut off the main ridge nearby that, bowls, things that we had mentioned.
Hey, Justin, real quick. I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt, but
no, you're fine. Go ahead.
This bump and dump thing, and we've talked about this, and you pull this off more than anyone I know, and you purposefully do it, which I think is just so cool. So correct me if I'm wrong here. Like, I would assume, if you're gonna purposefully do that, you're gonna try to do this fairly early in the day. Obviously, when they're bedded, so you're gonna wait probably past mid morning at least. Maybe go in around lunchtime. Maybe 1 o'clock, 11 to 1 o'clock, somewhere in there. Mm-hmm. And obviously, you're playing the wind. Your wind's in your favor, and you have an area that you're targeting based on wind direction and the terrain features that you've looked at on the map. And you're going to kind of slip through there, and you're trying to bump this deer like a soft bump. You don't want this deer to smell you. If he sees you or hears you, not a big deal. That's kind of the goal, but you want a soft bump, not a violent bump, or you damn near step on him, or you don't want him to wind you. And then once he's gone, you're quickly analyzing the situation and estimating where you think that deer is going to circle back downwind to scent check that bed and come back. And you've had great luck, even on the same day, of deer doing that. And I also would assume if you sat there that afternoon and he didn't come back, you'd probably give it one more sit in the morning. Would that be an accurate statement?
That would be accurate. Maybe even another shot, the following day, because I have seen to where, and again, this is going to be wind. I mean, say you jump him off of a point, on a northwest wind or whatever, and the next day it's going to be south. Well, that could change things up. So, but yeah, Andy, you're absolutely correct. I'm not trying to just blow them completely out of the area. Ideally, you want them just to kind of jump up, and just kind of trot off, because I've seen that. And that's when I have had the best luck at them coming right back in that same day. And a lot of times it seems like they hear me more so than seeing, and obviously not smelling me. They'll just kind of, shut off like a deer that's spooked, but not, they're not running out of the country type thing. And I've seen it so often to where they'll just loop around and they'll try to figure out what that was. I had one that I killed a couple of years ago, literally came right back in on the exact trail that I walked into when I bumped him, and he was smelling me. Granted, I'm sure that deer thought that whatever it was, just like a coyote, if they run through and they bump them up, they probably circle around and do the same thing, come right back in there. That's since, an hour old now, that whatever it was is long gone. They slip right back into the bedding area. The only problem for him was I was still in there. I was still in there, and I was actually looking it over to pick a tree for the following day. And that hunt really opened my eye to it on, killing them on the same day. But I have done it, and then, came back the following day or 2 days later, or even 5 days later, and killed them coming out of there. So that'd be my go-to in the early season. For the pre-rut, I'm probably going to do the same thing, only I'm going to be paying more attention to where like the doe pockets are, the doe groups are, and then look at some sign, in and around them, maybe trying to even bump up some does, trying to figure out exactly where they're laying down at, and then looking, downwind of those areas and trying to, find setups accordingly to that. Yes, would be my go-to.
There's I want to tell this story real quick because it's the epitome of the type of hunter you are, Justin. And I don't even know if this was hill country. You can allude to that, but it has more to do with your style. But you hunted a different state this year. I'm not going to dive into it, but it's actually a spot that I told you about. Mm-hmm. And just so happened that I knew several hunters that were hunting that same piece of public land while you were there, including one of the very best, John Eberhardt, and several other very accomplished hunters. And I don't think he was there that long, but some of those guys were there darn near 2 weeks. And it sounded like it was some tough hunting, tons of pressure. And you are the only person out of all those people that pulled a deer out of there, and you pulled an absolute giant out of there in just a few days. And it was just incredible. I mean, it was just incredible. But you told me, we talked about this hunt, and you were on foot doing just exactly what you're talking about a lot of the time, kind of still hunting, trying to get into, where a big buck was living. And if you needed to get him up on his feet and bump him, then so be it. Because then now you know what you're hunting. But I don't know. I just did that. I did actually kick that deer. I'm almost 100% sure, Andy, that I kicked that deer up. I didn't actually see him take off. I heard him. I got up there to the bed. I looked it over. There was plenty of sign in there. And I think I killed him 2 days later, coming back into that same general area. That thing was just a giant. Just a giant.
This is Justin is so good at that. Andy said it, but just to hear it from me too. Like, this is where I've never seen anything like it. That just bare woodsmanship of understanding the deer. You mentioned something, Justin, that I wanted to kind of call out, and that's, you said, when they get bumped and they come back, they don't pay as much attention to your sign, your ground scent. And I think that's true. And so a big buck moving through the woods, hits human scent. He's on the move. He locks up. He's worried. But he gets bumped out of somewhere. Deer, 99% places they live in North America, they're running into humans. You know, they're getting bumped up by people. So they get bumped up, and if he gets bumped up, maybe he knew you were a hunter, a human. I do agree. Like, if they smell you, the odds go way down. But I think that I think that the deer, if they get bumped up and come back, they knew somebody was walking through there. So like, oh, yep, he was there 2 hours ago, and then he dies because Justin's still standing there, you know? So that's a big, like, I think they're less worried about ground scent under those specific circumstances, you know? Not going to say, I mean, they might still lock up, but they seem to, if they think it's just somebody moving through, they're less worried, and they'll be wary coming back. They'll probably try to sneak back in, but it's not like them being on the move and then hitting ground scent. That's when they freak out. You know, when they're already on the move. Yeah.
Spot on with that, Joe. I actually got to watch that deer from probably a good, and I'm talking about a deer I killed a few years ago. I got to watch him. Like I said, I bumped him on the same day. He made a loop and came back in, and I got him. But I watched him come into the bed from a good, 80, 90 yards, you know, and he just like a big buck moves through the woods. I mean, he, without a doubt, he had his nose to the ground. He was smelling where I was. Take a few steps, he'd stop, and he'd just stand there, and, you know, he'd look around. And, I mean, he did that all the way, and it took him forever to get in there. And to say I held it together would be a lie. I was shaking like a leaf as he was coming back in, but it worked out, and that really opened my eyes to that. Like I said, I wasn't there on purpose to do that day. I was looking the area over, but it just so happened that I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, and the rest was history. You know, it worked out. So, but I can tell you a lot of stories too where, you know, I've jumped the deer up, and I set up or whatever, thinking they would come back, and they didn't. So, yeah, you know, of course, it doesn't always work.
I got a couple follow-up questions on that. Number one, we hear about this bump and dump tactic, and it makes sense, but it seems like the real crux, like the real trick that separates your average Joe from the guy like you who's actually getting it done. And that wasn't a knock on you, Joe. You're no average Joe.
Well, yeah, I freely admit I'm not really good at this tactic. Like, I don't have a lot of confidence in it.
Well, then I'll say,
and it's not because it doesn't work, you know. So feel free to use my name. Right, I believe it works. It's just Justin's great at this.
So then what separates you from average Joe here on the line is that the trick seems to be in picking the right tree for the setup. Like, that seems to be the really tricky spot, is figuring out the way to set up and anticipating how that buck's going to come back in, anticipating how he'll use the wind. That seems just really tricky. There seems like a really narrow line you've got to walk between being in the right place to be close to being in range of whatever that trail or where that bed is, et cetera, but then also anticipating how he's reacting to this bump he had. So question number one is, I'd love more detail on how you're thinking through where you're going to set up. And then question number two is, bump and dumps like this in hill country, is that any different than in flatter terrain? I'm imagining that on some of these types of points or bedding up on high on bowls, these bucks, it's going to be harder to get close to a buck like that without them seeing you from a distance because of the way they use terrain to their advantage. It just seems harder. I'm thinking it would be harder to pull off a bump and dump without a buck bumping way sooner than you would ever be able to get close enough to know where he was bedded. So just curious if there's anything when it comes to those types of hilly situations where it's just tough to get close enough to one to know where that bed was. So question 1 and 2, sorry to give you a double whammy there, but give me the real details on that setup and your thought process first.
Well, in the hills, I think you're correct. It is definitely hard to get close enough to see them, because I think a lot of times they get out of there before you, or aware of them even being there. But then again, I've also had, big bucks really hold tight in area and scare the heck out of you when they jump up, because you're right next to them or whatever. But in the hills, I mean, with the terrain and everything, I'm usually, once I jump one and I feel like that, he didn't get my wind, and he didn't take off, he didn't bust off out of there like he was scared to death. I'm usually looking at the terrain around that deer. I feel like it's going to try to get downwind of that. So if it's, say if it's a bowl, he's probably going to try to use that other side of the ridge to come back in, well out of sight or anything. But it's hard to explain because it's situational based on the terrain around there. I had a buddy, and I think I sent this to you, Andy, that did it. He went in and was setting up on a deer, and he bumped him. And the ridge, it was kind of like the point this deer was bedding on. Well, then the main ridge, say extends back to the south, and then it kind of made a 90 right there and looped around down to another point that dropped down on. So I told him, I said, well, I would slip back on that ridge back there, that the wind was blowing back in that direction. And sure enough, that deer just, he dropped down off that point, and he circled around, and he started coming up this other point that would have probably been about 100 yards, maybe 80 to 100 yards distance between there. And unfortunately, the shot didn't go so well. He missed it, but the deer he came back. I mean, he was circling back around, and I'm confident he was circling back around to figure out what that was. So the terrain would be the number one thing for me. I'm looking at terrain and how I think that deer will get downwind of that position that I was at, downwind of his bed, and how he'll loop back. And sure, I don't always get it right. There's definitely times where, like I said, I don't see him come back, and I'm sure maybe they looped a little further out than I, anticipated. But and what was your second question there, Mark, on that?
Well, yeah. So part one, you kind of answered both of them together. Okay. So it kind of worked out. But if you have anything else when it comes to the thought process on picking the tree and or unique aspects in the hills, and you kind of combined them. But if there's anything else as far as picking the right tree in that situation, I'll take it. Otherwise, Andy, you can jump in.
Well, picking the tree and stuff. Actually, a couple of them I've killed off the ground. I did it this year, early season. I jumped one up. Actually, I jumped this deer up right next to a road, and he ran out across the road, which really shocked me that he went that direction. But he crossed the road, so I looked at it, and this was, it's still country, but this was kind of down off in a wide bottom, and I looked it over, and I knew about 250 yards down, what it was a block of timber, kind of like a triangular shaped block of timber. At the tip of that was a tree line that went down and split this field. And it was kind of like in a swale. And then that went down and feed. And, say if you would go left, it would let off to some bigger timber. To the right was some persimmon trees. Well, I felt pretty confident that deer was, heading that direction. The sign leading out of that, pretty much told the story. So after I jumped him and I was looking over that timber, it's about 1.5 acres size. I knew that I wasn't going to be able to cover all that if he came back in. And as you got toward the tip of that, the winds kind of got funky up there. So I just looked that situation over. I thought my best crack would be to move out of there, kind of walk off in a direction like going back toward the road in case he did try to, follow me out. And I walked out that direction, and I kind of made a loop in the field and dumped down off kind of in this little valley, and set up down there thinking that deer would probably, because I bumped him, I think at 3 in the afternoon, and that's when it's getting dark at like 6:30, almost 7. And it worked out. He came back in, came down through there, and just carried on about his normal evening, thinking I was long gone. And that was probably a 2.5 to 3 hour stretch in between that time. So as far as picking the right tree, I don't know. I just have to look the situation over. It's kind of gut feeling, instinctual type thing, I guess, just being in that situation, because they're all so different. It's hard to, if I had, an example in front of me or something, I could, maybe go about answering that a little better. But
yeah, no, that's helpful. Okay, I think Andy, unless you want to correct me unless I'm wrong here, I think we need to hear Joe now answer your example as far as the new property in Southern Ohio or Kentucky, right?
That's right, Joe. So, yep, brand new hill country ground. Your strategy from start to finish, early season, and then rut.
Yeah. Going in brand new. I freely admit it. It's distinctly different from Justin. He's as you guys could tell for the last 10, 15 minutes, he's next level in that. Just kind of snooping around, bumping them. That's incredible. He's a hunter I want to be when I grow up. So. In those circumstances. So I like to be efficient with my time. So I do a lot of scouting. I pay attention to tracks, I pay attention to hot sign and food sources and all that. But really just to be efficient, if I'm it's a great big piece of property, it's maybe thousands of acres. And I'm mapping out like potential bedding, based on like stem count and points, terrain features, funnels and like the turkey feet, that we talked about, like on a GPS, and I'm mapping all that out ahead of time so I can go in and basically I'm scouting too. And I want to be, like I said, efficient with my time. I'm going to swing a big loop through the area. And my goal is to cover as much ground as efficiently as possible. And a lot of times, like, I'll have my bow with me, and sticks and tree. I use a tree saddle. It's light and mobile. And if I hit a spot where I think it's worth setting up, say, acorns are falling early season, and there's, a fresh rubber too, and, big tracks, and it's, just up the ridge from a bunch of secondary points. Obviously I'll be looking for a setup, or I might be just, I'm probably a little heavier handed than Justin. I don't think I quite as touch about stop and set up, and I'll come through. I'll just, run through it, but still the mentality of like, if I bump something, or even if I bump it hard, I might come back there, a few days later. And I have, done setting up, had deer come back. I freely admit I have not killed one doing that. I've come real close a couple of times, but I haven't. I won't lie to you. And it's more just, being good at it, with practice, you get better at it. So I like to have a real, as much as, I like cyber scouting, whatever, I don't have high confidence until I put boots on the ground and walk through an area. That's kind of my angle. So I'll, like I said, it might be 5,000 acres that I'm dealing with. I'll put in 8 miles, in one day and just swing a big loop. And then I feel a lot more comfortable about, okay, where are the deer distributed in that area? Where's the food right now? That varies so much early season. And it can depend, are the white oaks fallen? Are the red oaks fallen? Are there any white oaks? Are there any acorns whatsoever? Are they, for persimmons, like Justin mentioned, there's different, early seasons about what's hot right now. It's not last week. It's not next week. You really got to be, things shift really rapidly. And then, my favorite time period is like the pre-rut into the early rut phases. I just love hunting that time period. Bucks are moving more, but they're still really consistent. not too erratic movement, just following does in heat before any does come into, or hardly any does come into estrus. So then it's more, okay, where are the doe groups? And the bucks are nearby. They're not necessarily chasing or cruising yet, but the bucks are going to keep tabs on those doe groups. So that's where it really, I'll be focusing more on those, like, the high turkey feet or the low turkey feet, as we talked about in that pre-rut period, the thermal hubs, hunting those spots, because usually, like those turkey feet, they a lot of times have does bedded around there too. And that's when that week build up into the rut, that's when a lot of times you start seeing bucks get visible in those areas, where other times of the year they may not be anywhere around there, because they don't need to, they don't care about does. So that's kind of how I tackle it. It's probably more just focusing on strategy and preparation, because that's kind of my style, and that's what I would stress. Justin doesn't have, he's got the best style for him, not necessarily going to be a great fit for anybody else. I've got the best, I'm, working on the best style for me, so if you want to be the best hunter you can be, find something that works for you. Don't try to copy somebody else. You can get ideas from you can get ideas from somebody else. I listen to Justin, Andy, you, Mark, we listen to each other, but, I do think some people kind of get hung up on, I'm doing what so-and-so is doing. Yeah. That you spend, you kind of waste spinning your wheels if you just kind of replicate. Don't try to replicate, find what works for you.
Yeah. I love that you guys answered that so differently. And I kind of thought you might, but you guys are both playing to your strengths. Like Joe, it's exactly how I thought you would answer that. Your hunts are very well thought out and very strategic, and a lot of times you anticipate exactly what is going to happen, even with your deer drives. I mean, everything is so exact, and I know it doesn't play out perfectly every time, but it plays out just the way you think enough for you to be successful on multiple big bucks a year on very limited time. And it just impresses me so much. And then Justin, like, Joe said it best, man, just on the fly woodsmanship skills and more of that aggressive instinctual approach. So cool. I feel like I do a little bit of both of those styles, but I don't feel as seasoned as either of you in your style at all. And that's what I love. I just love talking to you guys because I learned so much. And there's a couple things after talking about that I want to expand on. One is food in the hills, but we'll get to that in a second. But so one of my things, when I go to hill country, it's been every time, actually, it's been during the rut. I've never went early season. And I've always focused on terrain features, thinking bucks are on the move. I'm going to play the odds and try to get in these terrain funnels, these terrain features that should funnel movement, if assuming the bucks are moving. So I usually wait for a good weather pattern, the right time of year, the right conditions for that to happen. And I've had great luck with that. But, obviously I don't always kill the biggest deer in the woods in that type of situation. So I guess my question for both of you is, during the rut, do you do that same thing? Or do you still focus on some of these known buck bedding areas, or where this deer has been living most of the year? I know Dan has talked about that. He's still, even during the rut, he's still bouncing around to some of those known buck bedding areas. So I was curious to see what you guys do. For me, like when I go to an unfamiliar area, I don't know what buck is there. So I don't even know where a specific buck is living. And Joe, I know you are really tuned into where a lot of these bucks you're hunting are living. So just curious, during the rut, is it one strategy more than the other, terrain versus bedding, or is it more does? What do you think? Let's go with Joe first.
Yeah. Well, it depends, of course. But I would probably, you're right. Like I'm fanatical, I live in Iowa. Majority of my hunting's in Iowa. I'm able to hunt, even I'm hunting a lot of public land, I'm able to hunt deer for several years. We've got a good age structure. Everybody knows that. So I can, I cover a ton of land to find these deer. They're not easy to find. They're not on every piece of public, but I can find, 5, 6-year-old bucks. And I can, my goal is to detect that deer even when I spread myself so thin that I don't, I might, I'll get a deer on trail camera. I never hunted that property. I was like, oh, that's a nice 4-year-old, and hopefully I got him on camera, in January. And he made it through, so he's going to be around next year, and maybe I'll get a couple of years of pictures. And then I can really, and layer on scouting, spring scouting on top of that. Maybe a hunt or two after like I get a couple of years of history with a deer, and I really map out exactly how he's using that area. Mm-hmm. And almost always they're not entirely, we actually talked about this here earlier, but they're not entirely on a piece of public. They're like, you're hunting a tiny little corner of the range. So you got like one opportunity or maybe a couple opportunities to kill that deer where he's crossing public in daylight, or he's bedded in one spot on public. So, what I'm going at, to answer your question a long way around, I'm relying on that last year's history, and if it's a rut, usually it's this buck was cruising through this area in daylight the last year or the last couple of years. And it might be to a doe bedding area. I do target, in the hills, I tend to think the bucks shift bedding, into the rut. Most of them do. So their bedding in the rut tends to be closer to doe bedding. Sometimes they're bedding even in what would otherwise be a doe bedding area. If it's a rut, they might be laying down in there. But they're doing it where I knew they were doing it last year, and that's what I really key in on. That's what I just laser focus. I've gotten probably a majority of my deer that from multi-year history where I knew that buck, like, okay, like the last 10 days of October is my time to kill this buck. I need this wind direction. I'm hunting at that spot, and that's my chance. So that's what I'm targeting. So it's not necessarily more doe bedding or more. It might be doe bedding. It might be just a buck cruising route. It might be a buck bedding spot. That really depends, but I'm detecting what it is well in advance. So
yeah, so a lot of it probably boils down to your knowledge of the individual deer. Like when I travel, I don't have that.
Yeah,
so
exactly. Yeah,
I'm pretty happy with any type of mature buck, regardless of what it is.
I would say your strategy is rock solid. You look at terrain, you look at doe bedding, and it's really those bucks are moving in between the doe bedding areas if you time it right. And it's not, right in the middle. Even if it's right in the middle of lockdown, they're still, might be up looking for another hot doe. But you just you want as many layers as possible. You want, like we talked about, those turkey feet, and being a thermal hub and the shortest distance between a point. That's what you need to key in on. If you're not worried, not worrying about deer history. And I know the vast majority, like that's what gets me super excited. Like I want to kill a buck that, I've stalked and, assassinated him basically. But that's not everybody's situation. And that's when, you just, you dial in on the terrain, the cover, the does.
Yep. Justin, I'm guessing it's probably a combination of what Joe said and what I do, depending on your familiarity with the deer in question. Would that be accurate?
Yeah. So if we're talking a piece that I'm familiar with in the does and where they bed at, I think Joe touched on this earlier. So generally, I find myself trying to kill a buck that is bedded on private land. Well, you get into the rut, and they will move closer to the doe group. And I know, from experience, I know generally where that's going to be, where the bucks tend to move in at and bed up closer to them. So I kind of base a lot of it on that, on the history. But if we're going off of, something that I don't know, then yeah, it's going to be terrain. It's definitely going to be terrain. And if I can find a hot food source, like say it's a year where there's low acorns or whatever, and I find a spot that's dropping those, I'm not opposed even in the rut to sit up there, because that's going to draw all the does in, and the bucks are going to come through there and check them out. So, it's a variation of, it depends on, I guess, if I have history with the property. If we're talking something new or something I've hunted.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that leads me to, I know we're getting a little long here. I got just a couple more questions. This is awesome stuff. Acorns, food in general, but specifically acorns. I'll admit that I'm pretty green when it comes to acorns. Obviously, it's not hard to find red and white acorns. It doesn't play a huge strategy for me personally around home. Sometimes it can, but not a lot. And I know in the hill country, it can be everything. So I just want to touch on how big of impact does that have on your strategy when it comes to chasing these older deer. So Justin, you and I talked about it a little bit. So why don't you start with that?
Oh man, it's huge. Finding those, it depends on the year too. Some years you have them it just seems like they're everywhere. You don't find those spots that the deer really congregate to, I guess, that really is a hot, this term feed tree I've heard. But that's the best way to put it, a feed tree that all the deer are really hitting. So this year, we did not have acorns at all. There was a few here and there. When they were dropping, it was just like, that's where the deer were. But yeah, it's huge. If you know where the bucks are bedding and, and they're working for the ag, a lot of them will hang up on those acorn trees on the way to, an ag field. So yeah, it's huge. It gives you at least an idea of where the deer are going to travel, where he's kind of heading off to, even if the ag's over here, but there's, acorns up on this ridge that, isn't in the same direction. He may head there first, hang up and eat, and, work his way off down to the ag. So yeah, it's huge. They're huge.
So like if one thing I noticed down in Ohio is like bucks tend to have obviously their little core range, it might encompass, 2 or 3 ridges, maybe more, but I just noticed that I get pictures of them and see them repeatedly on, these 2 or 3 ridges. They got their little areas. So you're just looking for, if you're after a particular buck, you're just looking for that concentration of acorns in that system. Cause I've always been, and I think it's inbred in me from hunting Michigan, at all costs, do not let the deer know that you're even in the area. I've never had good luck. Once I've bumped a deer, a mature buck, I've never had good luck even seeing that deer again. I've told you that, Justin. So I'm trying to wrap my mind around more when I travel out of state that, deer are very different. And I'm starting to see that from state to state to state. They all behave and tolerate different things. But in hill country, let's say I'm trying to find that where the hot, like you said, hot feed tree or hot little area of acorns, man, you can cover a lot of ground because there's a lot of these these pieces of hill country have oaks everywhere. And I was down in Southern Ohio for New Year's, and I did some scouting down there, and it was like I walked a ton of ground, and then I found fresh acorns even on January 1st, fresh acorns on the ground. But man, I sure had to walk a lot to find that. And it's just like, I just thought about all the deer that I must have just educated, you know what I mean? Right. Going through that area. So that's something I struggle with, as far as like looking for food, in the hill country and having to cover so much ground to look for that. So I don't know. What do you think on that?
Well, like, are you talking, how familiar are you with that? I mean, do you know generally where the bucks are bedding at anyways? I mean, outside of not even looking at the food. I mean, do you know for the most part where?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm thinking more in terms of areas that I'm not familiar with, that I haven't hunted before, because, you know, my plan is to hunt some new hill country. So I'm thinking more in terms of that. So yeah, obviously, you know, when you have an idea where these bucks are bedded and where they're living, it's easier to kind of work around that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, for me, I would be looking for either trying to find where the deer is, you know, obviously is bedding at, or if I run into, say, a white oak or something up on the top of a ridge and it just has a ton of deer sign around it. Well, if you can kind of work out on the perimeter of that, you know, for the most part, these bucks, even in the early season, they're going to have some sign, you know, working toward it coming in. Grapes and stuff, and grapes and big tracks and scrapes and stuff. I mean, I've killed several bucks, just based off that alone. Big tracks in a scrape coming through there, not even being 100% sure, you know, where the buck is bedding at. I mean, it's a gamble sometimes. Sometimes you set up on it and he may be coming through there at night, but I think the sign,
especially early season.
Yes.
Early season, right, Justin? Yeah.
Absolutely.
And they're going to be close by. Yeah.
Right. That would be my kind of go-to. I would be looking for the sign on the perimeter of that tree, working out toward it, you know, to where toward points or a bowl, you know, that we had talked about earlier, some of those deer bedding at.
Okay.
So that's how I would go about it.
Joe, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, a lot like what he said. So this past year we had a few more acorns, I think, around here, eastern Iowa, than what Justin said, but still not a big crop. So by mid to late November, they were gone, and the deer were back heavy on the crop fields. And I will say, I mean, a lot of people know this, but like, you can tell immediately, as if you're in farm country, you can tell immediately when the acorns are falling, because the deer disappear from the field.
Yeah.
You know, there's no deer. Oh, well, you know, the acorns are falling. You don't need to even set foot in the woods to know that. So, you know, that's something I watch for. And when they show back up, well, there's either no acorns in the area, or they've eaten them all up. You know, they show back up in the crop fields. So like I saw, starting in mid-November, all of a sudden deer really, became way more visible in the crop fields, beating does and stuff. And that's actually, I found how I killed one of my bucks this past year is I found like the last spot, I think, that I knew about where there was still acorns in the ground in late November. I killed a giant old monster deer that I don't know. I think he's 8 years old. I can't prove it, but I have a trail camera photo or two of him from several years ago, and his teeth are worn flat to his gums. So he's coming to acorns, and the does that were also drawn to that oak flat. And that's, you know, late November, post rut, or tail end of the rut. Early season, everything's, you know, squished down. Most of the bucks are moving way less. It gets tough in the real early season. One of the big things I've struggled with virtually within eyesight of where they're feeding. And that's, you find where they feed and, you're in trouble already sometimes. But if at the same time, it can be real thick. So maybe they're bedded within 100 yards of you. If you're finding, you got a scrape nearby, or you see a fresh rub or two in big tracks coming to patch oak trees. Don't assume you spooked him. He might be bedded, 80 yards away, but he hasn't seen you yet. So yeah, you can have some luck just scouting in blind. When you know the area and you know where the oak trees are, it does help a lot, obviously. And then you can just, you know how to get in, check the oaks and be like, are they fallen? Are there any acorns? Is there, buck sign? If there's not, there might be. I really focus on those big tracks, just like you do, Justin. The area might be tore up. There might be even rubs, but if I'm not finding those big tracks, I'm like, oh, there's probably a couple of little bucks running around. I'm not going to waste a hunt. I'm going to keep going. Try to find a big set of tracks, or, if I see a rub and it's real tall off the ground, that's, something else to cue in on. That's
exactly
fresh night early season. Yeah.
Agree with that. Yeah. Do you see that generally, Joe, like with the smaller deer, the ones usually tearing the woods up?
Yep. So around here it might be a little different, because obviously we got a fairly good air structure, but the 2 and 3 year olds tear the places up. They just, most of the time, if I walk into an area and there's rubs everywhere, they aren't particularly high off the ground. A lot of guys get super excited, and I'm like, I start looking. I want to see a big whopper set of tracks, or a rub that's waist high on me, and I'm a tall guy. And then I'm like, then my nose starts twitching.
Joe, for people, sorry, I'm gonna quick follow-up question, just for people that are newer to this, that are maybe thinking, what's a whopper set of tracks? How do you quantify that? What if you had to put some kind of measurement around that would tell you, like, yeah, that's a big one? What would you tell someone?
Oh, I don't. So that varies by region of the country. And it, some, I know there's a rule of thumb, or it's like, oh, it's a 4-finger track. Well, I've got big hands. I'm just a large guy. I've got big hands, and I've never seen a 4-finger track made by a deer. Like, a 4-finger track is probably a bull elk on me. So, like, I've gone around a measured track. So other guys don't even do that. But like a big track for me, if it gets to be 2.5 inches or wider, and not splayed out, ignore those running tracks. You can get a big doe looking like a giant buck if it's running, especially up, down a hill or something. I kind of ignore the splayed out tracks. In soft ground, they all splay out. But in firmer ground, I want a standing or a walking track, 2.5 inches or wider for around here. And I think it varies. I think in some parts of the country it might be bigger. Other parts of the country, probably not nearly that big. That's a big buck. And I will say, I have seen a like a majority. You find a big track, it's a big old deer, but a high number of bucks that I've killed actually had doe-sized feet, like big doe-sized feet. Not a majority, but like, I don't know, 30%, like way more than you'd think. I killed a buck this year. He weighed 240 pounds, field dressed, mid-November, and that deer, I have photos of his hoof, and that deer had a doe-size hoof, and he had a huge body, and he was a 170 plus inch 16-pointer, and he had a doe-size foot. So they come in all shapes and sizes. That's not like I could pull up half a dozen other deer that I've killed that were in similar, but you find a big track, that's a big buck. That's still a rule. So yeah.
Cool. Justin, were you trying to say something?
No, I mean, I agree. I think it absolutely varies on size, just like, or on location, like Joe was saying, because I've seen it. Like, you go from, the Missouri to Illinois, and there's an older age structure over there, and the tracks over there, the deer just there's a big difference in a big buck track in Missouri versus Illinois from my experience. But going back earlier, one question, Joe, when you killed that one buck going to Acorns, did you know where he was bedding at, or was that you just setting up on sign?
Yeah, I was setting up on sign, but I knew the property, so I knew he was coming from his big overgrown kind of weed field that they like to bed in. So it's a fallow field, like CRP, but brushier. So I figured he was coming up that ridge system from that. Sure enough, that's what he did. But that was the first deer I've killed in a few years that I did not know about him really in advance. I was hunting more your style, where I was like, yeah, this feels like a good spot. So.
Cool.
That's a good feeling, though. I've really come, a lot of times the deer I kill around home, like, Northern Ohio, Michigan, a lot of times I know the deer, I have some familiarity with them, and it's cool. And it's cool to learn that history, but I really love that feeling like we had when we were younger, when you don't know what's out there. And that's what I get to experience when I travel. And I just love that, the element of surprise. And, it's just, if that buck makes my heart skip, I'm drawn back. And I just really love that. It's such a cool feeling. And with so much technology now these days, the cell cameras and, people running all kinds of crap, it's like there's hardly any secrets left. You know what I mean? And I love traveling and just leaving the cameras at home and just hunting off instinct and sign and shooting whatever gets me excited.
Yeah,
I agree.
There is definitely something to be said by that. Yeah. I keep threatening myself, one of these years, I'm just going to leave all my cameras in the cupboard and just do that. And I will. It's just haven't done it yet.
Well, you know what we got to do, Joe, is we got to make a pact that one of these years you and Dan Johnson promise not to use trail cameras in a year. It will get you guys to promise it on the podcast, and then we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my last question. What is your guys' trail cam strategy in the hills? Where you like to put them, how you like to check them, if it's a mix of leaving them out year round and some you check more frequently, what types of terrain features, scrapes, benches, saddles, give me the rundown of how you personally use trail cameras in the hills. Justin?
Yeah, it depends on a lot what you said there. Like if it's one I'm going to leave, and I'll admit this, I got this from Joe. I think his strategy is obviously sound. So I've got to where the past 4 or 5 years I've left a lot of cameras out, and I'll put them right in near buck bedding. It may be on a ditch crossing, or a saddle leading out of a bowl, like I was talking about earlier, or something like that, some terrain feature in near the bedding area, and I'll just leave that in there for the majority of the season. I've actually got some cameras out now that I put out in late August and haven't been back to them yet. So, but the other ones, around fields and stuff like that, ones I can slip in and check. I know we've talked about this before, but the ones that you can get in like that you're probably not going to get daylight pictures on, but you're just trying to see what's in the area or see if there is a mature buck in the area, and a lot of them I'll throw up as I'm scouting. If I see a big set of tracks, leading out into a field, and I'll throw that camera up to try to get an idea of what it is. A lot of it's terrain features. I like ditch crossings. I really like ditch crossings because it funnels deer down, and a lot of times too you can get a good idea just looking at the tracks on the ditch crossing of what's moving through there. So for me, that would probably be the majority of my trail camera placement right here at ditch crossing.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Joe?
Yeah, I like ditch crossings too. So yeah, if anybody hasn't heard my spiel, I really focus on leaving them soak. I'm just like Justin, like I've got quite maybe half a dozen cameras out yet. It's early January right now that I've been slowly picking them up over the last few weeks. But I've got some cameras out, and I'll be looking at, when bucks were, what time of year they were on camera. I recognize the deer from past years, and then all the weather conditions. For these spots, I really like thermal hubs too. I love sticking them down like in a thermal hub and figuring out, what conditions and exactly thermal. They are very time of year. Like the annual pattern. There's really pretty consistent annual patterns with hubs and the deer buck activity through them. Usually within a few days every year, it lights up. Boom. Some hubs, some hubs are used early season. Other hubs are more used during the rut. It depends where the bedding lays out in around them. But hubs are a really major part. I used to have cameras in more easy access areas, and I'd still have a couple here and there, but I don't anymore, and it's really just because of time. My time's so limited. I just that's been the struggle. As both of you have kind of shared a little bit, I struggle to get out there, and I have such limited time. I hunted 7 or 8 times this year with a bow, and it stressed me out. Like, that's pretty pathetic over the course of 2 months. And I don't have time to stop and check a camera. Like, I'll still speed scout, once or twice a week, but like, just if I have a camera, that's one more thing I got to do. So I've almost entirely now, and yeah, I'll check a camera while speed scouting, but I don't want it to be an extra thing. So I'll just, 90% of my cameras I start hanging them in July, August. By September, I want them all out, and most of them aren't going to get touched until December. So that's just kind of how it works. That's pretty much my, and since hopefully Dan Johnson is listening, I'll tell a quick story about another buck I screwed up on. In early November, I was after this great big white 8-pointer, and he was I knew where he was bedding. He was down in an oxbow on public land, and he was coming in and out of there. He'd coming out of there pretty consistent the previous year, and I figured he was still alive. And I went down there and I hunted, and I saw him. I planned on hunting a full day. Well, work called my name, and I could only hunt the morning. And I saw him that morning from a distance, and my gut, I had to climb down at noon, and my gut said, Joe, you're making a mistake. But I just could not stay in the tree. And I picked that camera up in December, and half an hour after I climbed down, and I did not check, so I bring the story up because I did not check that camera. That camera is 30 yards from my stand, but I had to cross a bunch of trails, check that camera, and I did not. I left it there. I could see it from my stand. Half an hour after I climbed down, that darn buck came through, and I could have killed him. So that one probably burns more than any other encounter I've had this year. So I've heard that story, and you sneer at people that climb down too early. Well, this year was me. So
well, what you pulled off though this year in such limited time with a bow during bow season is just incredible. You killed 2 awesome bucks. I know it was a frustrating year for you, but man, just great stuff. Mark, you got any other questions for these guys?
Well, I'll say first off, awesome work, all three of you guys, as far as having a hell of an interesting conversation. I have really enjoyed kicking back and listening and just enjoying this as a listener, really. But I do want to give you guys an opportunity for one last thought. And this is something I like to ask people on occasion. If I were to give you a billboard on the side of the highway, and you could put any simple message there for hunters, and let's say we're going to stick with a hill country theme. So if you could leave one last parting bit of wisdom that you had to put on a billboard, this could be one thing you want everyone to do, or one thing that everyone should, remember, or one thing that you don't want people to screw up on. And if you could synthesize it down to that one simple phrase you would put on that billboard, what would that be? And I'm actually going to ask you, Andy, as well. So Joe, tell me, what would your hill country billboard side of the highway be?
Oh man. I'd probably keep it pretty big and find your own way. I think that's more important than any, the details. You look at the differences between Andy and myself and Justin, yeah, there's overlap, but or stick to the basics. That's another one, I guess. Can I get 2 billboards?
Sure, why not? Buy one, get one free here.
Side. Yeah. Something like that. Look at Zach Fehrenbaugh with the Hunting Public. I just love how he hunts. It's completely different than how I hunt. He sneaks around, and even crazier than Justin seems like, or maybe he just carries a camera. Maybe Justin does the same thing, but he's just on his feet all the time. He's not standing very much. He's having crazy good luck in many different states. And he's learned through woodsmanship and attention to detail, and it's completely different than the strategy I've found that works for me. So, try new stuff, listen to different people, but really, try to find what works for you.
That's a hell of a lot of billboards now, Joe. But what about you, Justin? You got any idea?
Well, Joe kind of stole my answer there. I was going to say in season. I was going to say in season scouting, because for me, I have seen my success go through the roof by not being complacent, not just going out and finding a buck bed and then hunting near that buck bed, or finding big sign, or whatever it be, and just being complacent and hunting that to death, or hunting, when I get the opportunity, just on that spot that I may have found 2 weeks ago. Because we all know so many things are happening out there. I mean, it's changing day by day. So I would say in season scouting would
all right. Fine. I like it. And Andy, what do you got?
Yeah. I think my answer stems from the fact that I typically have hunted, pretty much all of my hill country experience has been during the rut, but mine's going to say 10 to 2, 10 o'clock to 2 p.m.
Yeah.
I have had during the rut, that time frame has been my most successful for seeing big deer on their feet, more so than in any other type of terrain. My mornings tend to be a little slow. My evenings tend to be a little slow, and that's probably because of where I'm sitting. But man, that midday time frame, when the conditions and the timing of year is right, just deadly. So keep your butt in the tree. 10 to 2.
10 to 2. Well, you definitely win for keeping it nice and tight and billboard sized, Andy, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great, guys. All three of you, thank you for taking the time. I learned a lot in this one. I'm excited to listen to it again and think through everything. A lot of great stories to review, and I know a lot of people are going to come out the other end of this one with something to work on and something to chew on. So thank you all, and I know it's only January right now as we're speaking, but good luck in about 9 months or whenever your next hunting season kicks off.
Yeah, it's kicking off right now. My season ended January 10th, so I think both of these other guys are in the same boat. This is where we earn the next deer. So
That's right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's good stuff right there. Great parting words. All right. That was a conversation, wasn't it? I mean, there was some really good stuff in there. Probably one of those episodes you need to listen to a time or two to collect it all and to make sense of it all. But man, I'm thrilled with how that turned out and excited for some of these other shows to come. Stay tuned on all that. Next week, we're hoping to have another one of these habitat deep dives, so stay tuned. Make sure you're following Wired to Hunt on Instagram and Facebook. We're going to be posting more updates there, as well as the Whitetail Weekly newsletter that comes out every Monday with the latest content from myself and other people on the Meat Eater team that are focused on whitetail stuff. So check it out. Stay tuned. Thank you for your time and attention. And until next time, stay wired to hunt.
I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. After 3 years of work, our follow-up to the Meat Eater Fish and Game Cookbook is here. It's the Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, campfire, and camp stove. Here is your book for everything that's best cooked or eaten outside, from grilling to open fire cooking to Dutch ovens to smokers to barbecue to backpacking meals to how to pull off the perfect fish fry, with pit stops along the way for lessons about Ice Age cooking methods and the best 5 ways to construct a cooking fire you can be proud of. And of course, we're focusing on wild game and fish here with over 100 recipes, including stuffed venison burgers 3 ways, wild duck with ahi verde sauce, a jerky made with cola, a gin and tonic made with fire-charred lemons, and grilled frog legs made with a sticky sweet sauce. This ain't your normal cookbook, so be prepared to be surprised. Get your copy now. For more info, visit themeateater.com or buy it wherever books are sold.